Welcome to another lecture in Introductory Psychology. This one deals with memory, specifically in terms of how we get information out of our permanent store, out of our long-term memory, and put it into our working memory or into our short-term memory to allow us to literally remember something. Now, how we remember basically is we are given some sort of cue, a retrieval cue. Now, if you're familiar with the theater or with music or the performing arts, you know, a cue means that it's your time to go and do something, usually, or your time to leave or whatever. And so retrieval cues are basically things that we use to tell us what to remember. You can think of a retrieval cue, if you're not familiar with the performing arts, as the word or words that you type into a search engine like Google or Bing. You type words in and it tells Google or Bing what to look for and what to retrieve for you. In a lot of ways, we think our memory works like a computer does, or maybe it's vice versa. But you need to have some sort of cue to tell you what to retrieve. Okay? For instance, if I said to you, when is your birthday? Birthday is a retrieval cue. Boom, your birthday probably just popped into your head. Hopefully. Okay? That's a retrieval cue. And when you are taking a test, the test questions are retrieval cues. And if it's a multiple choice, the answers that you're given might also be retrieval cues. But you have to be given something to tell you what to retrieve. Unfortunately, particularly if you use maintenance rehearsal instead of elaborative rehearsal, if you memorize something by saying it over and over and over again instead of putting it into your own words, you may find that the retrieval cue that you are given is not sufficient for you to be able to remember something. And what's kind of interesting is we see this a lot. I see this sometimes in students who are taking tests. Because oftentimes I can tell by how much they are massaging their heads. Because they put their hands on the heads, and there's like a big, head squeeze, head massage, as if it's going to help squeeze the information out of their brain. Usually what that means is they've almost got the answer. They've almost got the answer. It's right there. It's right. They could see it on the page, but they can't read it. They could just remember it. It's right. It's where it's right on the tip of their tongue. And indeed, it's called the tip of the tongue effect, which usually means that you don't have a good enough retrieval cue to actually get the information out. Okay? That you got a good enough retrieval cue to let you know roughly where it is, but not enough to let you actually... It's almost like when you lose your keys, and you're like, where did I put them? Where did I put my keys? Where did I put... And you might remember enough to be in the general area where you might have left them. Or where you left your car in the parking lot at the mall or at school. Where did I leave it? Where did I leave it? I know it was somewhere around here. And so that's also kind of the tip of the tongue effect, but with words in particular. And the way, of course, to try to remember where you put it might be to, look around to get to that area, to look around. Or with words, people start thinking around it. I know it was right before this and right after that, and it was on this page and there is this picture. What you're doing when you do that is you're trying to find more effective retrieval cues. If that one retrieval cue is not enough, you're going to try to find others. This is also where elaborative rehearsal helps. Because remember, in maintenance rehearsal, you have one retrieval cue, which is the exact format of the words that you put into your head by saying them over and over again. In elaborative rehearsal, you have lots of retrieval cues. You have the original words, you have your words, you have the examples. You have lots of ways to find that particular retrieval cue that will help. What might also help when people find the answer is a phenomenon called priming, which, by the way, is another example of psychology stealing words from other aspects of life and appropriating them. If you're familiar, for instance, with working with cars, old-style cars very often had to be primed before you could start them. You pounded on the gas pedal a couple of times, to get gas into the system so that when you turn the key it would actually work. You don't have to do that now, by the way, but you used to have to prime those cars. Or if you've ever had like a hand pump. When I was young, we used to sometimes go to a cottage where you had a hand pump, and you had to pump the pump a couple of times before water would actually come out, because you had to prime the pump. So priming, or if you've ever painted walls, if you have a dark color you want to cover with a light color, what do? You put a coat of primer down, which then allows you to put your color over it successfully. You're getting it ready. And priming can also help you get the answers. It's part of the reason why when you take a test, it's a lot easier to take a test where the questions are given in the same order that you learned the material than to take a test where they're all mixed up. Because if you learn material in a particular order, you're going to remember it best in that order. Because if you learned this first and that second, when you're thinking about that first thing, you're also kind of warming up the connections to the second thing. And then when you think about that second thing, you're kind of warming up the connections for the third thing. If the questions are all mixed up, you got to start from cold. Got to start from scratch every single time. And that takes longer, and it's a lot more difficult. So where the question is on the test can be a retrieval cue. Where you learned the information can be a retrieval cue. It's called context-dependent learning. We can use our surroundings as a retrieval cue. And there is some suggestion, although there's actually been some research saying that this might not be completely true. Do keep this in mind. It's the delightful thing about science is that it's always changing. But generally research tends to indicate that if you learn information in a particular environment, you will remember it best in that same particular environment. That's context-dependent learning. External is context. So if you learn the information in this particular room, you're going to remember it best in that particular room. I once taught at a school where for testing we actually went to a different room because we had so many students crammed into this one small lecture room. It was actually more of a laboratory. The students were almost literally sitting on each other's laps. It was not a good environment to give a test. And so we would move them to another room. But the students would find it more difficult to remember the information in that room because they had heard me talk about it in the other one. Okay. The big research for this actually was done in a rather brilliant experiment. I love it. That was done by a couple of researchers named Godden and Baddeley back in the 1970s. They gave people lists of words to learn, and all of the people were basically duded up as scuba divers. They were wearing the wetsuit, and they had the equipment, and the tanks, and the buoyancy compensator, and everything else. And half of them were asked to learn this list of words sitting on the side of the tank, out of the water. The other half were asked to learn the list of words like 10 feet down, underwater, waterproof paper, presumably. And then, a while later, they were asked to remember, to retrieve those same words. Except for each group, half of them were asked to remember the words in the environment they learned them, and half of them were asked to remember the words in the other environment. Notice the results here. People who learned the words on land and recalled them on land remembered a whole lot more words than people, for example, who learned them on land but remembered them underwater. Learned underwater, recalled that's lower. I suspect it's because we're not used to learning lists of words underwater. There's not a lot of classes where you learn lists of words underwater. And notice that these are about the same. So when you try to remember something in a different context, you oftentimes remember it less well than in the original context you learned. There has actually been, as I mentioned, some research that indicated that this may not be true, and that actually learning the information, relearning it in some ways in different contexts may help you remember it better. After all, if you learn the information at home, you're taking the test at school, that's different. I have actually had students ask me if they should come into the classroom and learn the information in the classroom because that's where they're going to take the test. And my usual reply is, it couldn't hurt. Okay, it's not necessarily going to guarantee that you're going to do better, but any little bit can help. I also recommend, for instance, that you take the test while sitting up and at a desk and in a quiet place to try to replicate the context as much as possible. Now, context-dependent learning is using your external environment as a cue, but you can also use your internal environment as a cue. That's called state-dependent learning. Have you ever noticed that when you're angry, it seems like all you can remember are things that piss you off? Or if you're sad, then all you can think of are sad things. We tend to remember things that not only match our external environment, but match our internal state. Okay? This is part of the reason why pulling an all-nighter before a test doesn't work very well. Because at the beginning of the night, you're fairly wide awake when you're memorizing things. By the end of the night, you're exhausted. Completely different physical and mental state. And then you're probably in a third state, whether or not you get to take a nap or something before the test. It really isn't a good thing. Because you're in such different internal states. Did you ever hear the really bad joke about the guy who got really, really, really drunk and put his keys down somewhere, and he couldn't remember where he put his keys once he became sober? And then he got really, 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 really drunk again and remembered where he put his keys? Don't try this at home, by the way, but that's state-dependent learning. So for instance, if you have an early class and the only way that you can be awake to take the test is to drink enough caffeine to float a small barge, then you might want to study after having drank that amount of caffeine, so that your internal state is the same for both. Now, what I was talking about before with emotion, where, for instance, people who are newly in love and are happy, all they remember are happy things and such like, that's a subset of state-dependent learning called the mood congruence effect. We tend to remember things that match our mood. Okay? You're happy, you remember happy things. You're sad, you remember sad things. It's basically state-dependent learning, but it's a subset. This might be, by the way, why people who are depressed never remember anything happy ever happening to them. They never remember being happy. They never remember anything good. And if you tell them, well, yes, this good thing happened to you a while back, I know because I was there, they'll say, no, it didn't happen like that, because all they can remember are the bad stuff. Now, we also don't memorize. As I mentioned before with long-term memory, we don't remember things word for word. And part of it may well be that we put things into our brain and paraphrase, but we certainly retrieve them and paraphrase. And in fact, it appears that when we are retrieving information very often, we're retrieving it from a whole bunch of little bits that we have laying around. It's a process that I call reconstruction. It's also called constructive processing, where basically we have to rebuild our memories from the scattered bits of things that we remember. And so we rebuild our memories with what we have, hopefully. This might be, though, why people remember things differently. Maybe they paid attention to different things. And so when they reconstruct their memory, when they retrieve it, they make it out of different building blocks. This also means, by the way, that you can remember something that's wrong, or remember something that never happened. It's called a pseudo-memory. And the misinformation effect can definitely have a role there. Pseudo means fake. Pseudo means fake, okay? And a pseudo-memory is just that. It's a fake memory. It's a memory that is not correct. It's a memory that may never have existed. And if you give someone wrong information about an event, which is called the misinformation, they will put that wrong information into their memory, making it a pseudo-memory. Elizabeth Loftus did a lot of research on this. There's an example, for instance, where people were asked to watch a slideshow with a car accident in it. Okay? And people were asked various things. They were asked, who was in the car, what color were the cars. This was after they watched it once. They waited sometimes. They went back. What was going on? Testing eyewitness memory, basically. And so what happened was, in this particular experiment, there were a lot of variations on it. So in this experiment, what happened was, so this particular slideshow, the cars hit each other, and so they showed, before, during, and after. Now, they also had, slides of the speedometer. They had slides of all sorts of other things, and the subjects were divided up into two groups. They were asked the exact same questions with one difference. One group of people was asked how fast were the cars going when they hit one another. The other group was asked how fast were the cars going when they smashed into one another. Other than that, they were asked completely the same thing. What's interesting is that the group that was asked about the cars hitting one another remembered something different than the group that was asked about the cars smashing into. The smashing into group remembered broken glass. The hitting did not. And you know something? There was no broken glass. But the people who were asked about smashing remember broken glass. They swore up and down sideways there was broken glass, okay? There was broken glass. And when they showed them the original slideshow where there was no broken glass, the people were like, no, you're faking that. That's a different one. They knew there was broken glass there. Why? Because they were asked about smashing. This is why, in a court case, lawyers need to be very, very careful about how they ask questions about memories, because simply by asking a question, simply by phrasing a question in a particular way, you can change someone's memory. So a lot of what you remember right now never happened.